Okay, it's a great pleasure to introduce the last speaker of the day, Seth Lazar. Ignore the thing about Mint Lab ANU. He's actually at the University of Hong Kong as a visiting professor. He's part of our faculty. Sometimes he hangs out at ANU, but most of the time he's here. So thanks for being, over to you.
So I'm going to try and use this. Is it working? The lavalier mic? All right, back. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about language model ethical competence. So a bit of a change from the rest of the day, but there will be some similar issues that come up. And I am starting out with this, although I'm going to try and talk about the philosophical upshots of LLM ethical competence. I'm coming at this from the perspective of caring about the actual practical impacts of language model agents in particular. And I put in the scare quotes around agents earlier today during Rosa's talk, just to make clear that I'm okay with whatever way we want to understand agents. But the basic point here is that, look, we've got really good chatbots, but now we're on the horizon of having pretty competent agents that are using LLMs as the kind of executive center of a more complex system that can take actions in the world and can operate without being supervised for sort of significant long sequences of action. There are a bunch of surveys that I put up on there. There are obvious problems with these at the moment, like it's really easy to do like a cool demo of an agent writing code, but they tend to crap out fairly fast. So there is a capability reliability gap. But I don't think that we should count on that gap being persistent. This is going to be something that radically changes the economy, how we interact with technology. I reckon that we're on a path for these sorts of technologies to be able to perform most of the tasks with digital technologies that a competent human can currently do. And I think that's going to have sort of massive societal impact. So I'm kind of coming at this from the lens of, all right, I think that we've got significantly more agentic systems and we need to figure out a way of making them more or less safe. Some recent progress that you'll all be familiar with. So O1 is an example of a system that is doing a lot more capable at reasoning than previous language models have been. Computer use by Anthropic. Other folks have shown how you can use language models as kind of browser or GUI agents, but Anthropic have gone ahead and actually deployed it. Some cool examples using various types of simulations that we can talk about later. So like chatbots are kind of, there's not an awful lot that a chatbot can do that can go wrong. They can say naughty things. On the whole, that's about the extent of it. And there was certainly lots of worry last year that you could use a chatbot to kind of help you build a chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapon. Those sorts of like uplift threats, where you've got the chatbot kind of uplifting the capabilities of a human, they seem to be fairly, not really very significant relative or compared with the alternatives. Language agents that are performing actions in the world, they could probably do stuff that's much more consequential, that creates much greater risks. And the kind of methods that we currently use to make language models safe, I don't think are going to be very useful for making language model agents safe. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that you might want to do, some different techniques for trying to make agents safe in the world. Basically, the idea of scalable alignment, which I'll talk about here, is that you can automate. It's about automating the control of these systems to make sure that they comport with some particular set of reasons or values that you care about. There's a lot of different approaches you can take. The thing that interests me is leveraging the capacity for kind of ethical competence and ethical reasoning that language models seem to have in order to actually kind of align the agents that are deployed in the world. Now, this kind of, the underlying kind of approach I'm thinking of is similar to what has been done a little bit with enhancing language models with other types of systems to enable them to perform better, and in particular planning. So Shibaraka Mampati has this approach that he calls like the LLM modulo approach, where although language models are not very good at planning on their own, if you pair them up with a verifier that is like a planning algorithm that kind of checks the degree to which their plans kind of conform to certain desiderata, then you can get them to perform better, right? And actually the LLM modulo pair does better than just the planning algorithm on its own. So I think that there's an obvious thought here that you can have a moral verifier that's going to judge an agent's plans and foreclose unethical options. I should also say, suggest the things it ought to do. Okay, I think this is a promising path. And reason why I think it's promising is that on its face, on their face, LLMs do seem to be really good at using moral language. But this leaves open the question of whether they are, in the sense that matters for this previous task, whether they're really ethically competent. Okay, so this is where we get into the sort of the story of the paper, right? So I'm going to evaluating the ethical capacities of LLMs and ask whether folks who are working on this are asking the right questions. And I think it's worth saying, like, although I'm going to say no, they're asking lots of really interesting questions. And, you know, my focus on this comes from a particular angle, and I don't expect everybody to approach this in the same way. But, you know, if they're not asking the right questions, how could we evaluate ethical competence? And this is something that we're doing in my lab at the moment. And so if as I suspect, I think what we're going to show is that they are pretty good at this, what would that mean for philosophy? All right, so a little bit more on the motivation around aligning language agents. I'm going to go through this part a little bit quick because I want to get to the philosophy bits at the end. And for those of you who are in Lingnan, which actually is only a couple of you, I did more on the first parts of the talk last week. All right, so those of you who know this literature will know that, like, even on its best days, like, well, so first starting point is like, what is it now? Like, it's December the 9th. So we're 2 years and maybe a couple of weeks since ChatGPT was launched. 2 weeks before that, Meta launched this model, Galactica, which was trained on scientific papers. And it was taken down within 3 days because it was just so easy to get it to say really toxic stuff, like talking about the health benefits of eating crushed glass or why everything's the fault of the Jews. That was like the state of language models up until like ChatGPT was launched. Then ChatGPT was launched, and it was like, oh wow, you can actually get a model that you can deploy to hundreds of millions of users that doesn't just kind of devolve into Nazi bullshit like really fast. That was amazing, and that made this whole kind of field like possible. The whole prospect of actually using language models to do stuff was conditioned on them not being super toxic. So it's worth saying that the methods that were used to do that, reinforcement learning with human feedback and with AI feedback, those are really significant achievements. But obviously, as we've gone on over the last couple of years, we've seen all of the different ways in which they fail. There's some cool papers here. The one led by Stephen Casper on open problems and fundamental limitations of reinforcement learning with human feedback. Shows that they're brittle, they're hackable. There was some cool stuff done on indirect prompt injection, which is basically when you kind of take over an agent or an LLM that has been instructed to do something else by introducing kind of supervening instructions. Loads of interesting work on that. The problems of these models kind of learning how to satisfy the human raters in ways that don't directly correspond with the things they're being rated for, but really are just being sycophantic or relate to style, like the reason why ChatGPT always like devolves to bullet points and bolding things. It's just that's what people happen to like. There's a kind of sycophancy that is being generated through these things. A really interesting paper that illustrates the lack of robustness in RLHF shows that when you're kind of trying to extend what seems to be good performance in one modality into another, you don't get any kind of generalization of that particular performance. So in this particular case, you train up a language model to be like good and to not be racist about stuff explicitly, but then you ask it a bunch of questions on a bunch of transcripts which convey the kind of dialects of the people who are kind of about whom it's being asked questions. And it makes kind of stereotypes and prejudiced assumptions about people on the basis of their dialects. So like, even though it seems like it knows how to not be a racist, it doesn't extend into the different modality. I argued like back last year that like there were kind of real and obvious problems of this nature with using the methods of language model alignment for aligning language model agents, because of this kind of inherent distribution shift that you get when you go from you're just producing text and you're evaluating on text to actions in the world. And like it's been multiply demonstrated now. Every time you actually kind of try and deploy an agent, even if the underlying language model is really nice, it will predictably do nasty stuff. So a fun one there is the Amazon Ring paper, which basically shows that if you kind of take the footage from an Amazon Ring camera and you ask a language model to make kind of predictions about like when it would be appropriate to call the police, given the behaviors that it sees in the footage, it will reliably just kind of do super racist stuff. Like it will make racist inferences. Again, even if it's a very nice language model. Similar sorts of things for like, you know, refusal trained language models will be much easier to jailbreak when they're operating a browser agent than when they're just kind of doing chat back and forth. Now, all of this basically comes about because in RLHF and RLAIF, you have like this really, really nice feature of isomorphism between the behavior that you're evaluating and the behavior that you ultimately want to control. They're really just the same thing. It's just chat and chat. When you're evaluating, when you're trying to do, to use these models to actually perform actions, then you lose that isomorphism. They're doing something in the world that might not necessarily be fully described through in the text descriptions that they have been trained on. Okay. There is an open question about whether we can do kind of simulation of like all the stuff that matters and train these agents within those simulations and do RLHF equivalent stuff there. And there's some cool papers that try and develop those sorts of simulations, but I think it's going to be a super hard problem. Okay, so this is where LLM modulo comes to the rescue, or could do. There's some cool papers on this, like sort of initial proofs of concept, which basically show that you can have like the model that is guiding the decision making of the agent is one model, and then there's another one that is evaluating or judging it. And you can do sort of a fairly narrow kind of classifier type approach, like you know what the wrong behavior is that you want to avoid, and you identify that. So that's the Jiminy Cricket paper by Dan Hendricks and co-authors. There's a similar approach in this paper by Silent et al., which is called testing language model agents safely in the wild. Again, you've got a model that is carrying out some particular task. You know the bad behavior that you want to identify. You have another model checking to see whether that bad behavior is going to come up. There's an obvious question there as to whether this could be done in a more general way. And in doing, basically by leveraging the capacities of language models to kind of do what seems on its face to be like ethical reasoning. It's kind of weird that, and I'm going to talk about this a lot more at the end, it's weird that language models are kind of, on the one hand, really good at using moral concepts, but on the other hand, they kind of suck at behaving morally. But like this is a way in which we can kind of gerrymander or jerry-rig the one into the other. We can get the fact that they're using moral concepts well to shape their behavior, hopefully. All right, so let's now turn to thinking about, okay, so I've been playing around with ChatGPT. You've all been doing so, and you've been giving it your favorite questions, and it seems like it's good at doing moral reasoning to you and me, but how do we actually get some sort of broader, deeper understanding of that? And where does the current science sit? So I'm going to go through this again quite quick. As you will notice, there's too much in this paper. But let's look at the existing evals. Let's just start by acknowledging that in general, the whole science of evaluating large language models faces a lot of problems. There's a lot of work to be done from the perspective of philosophy of science, some of which we were talking about just in the last session, on this kind of whole approach to thinking about language models. I'm not going to talk about that. There are also actually kind of a bunch of things, just even internally to the engineering side of things, where there are kind of predictable errors that people, or routine errors that people make, which are highlighted nicely in that Anchor Rule Ampath paper. Better Bench. I'm also not going to talk about these evals that basically try to tell you the kind of the moral personality or the moral identity of the language model. Maybe this might mean kind of doing like the world values survey on the model and saying, look, it's Western, educated, democratic, all the weird stuff. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things I think that when we looked at the literature, broadly speaking, seem to me to kind of fit the definition of like something that would be ethical competence, something that might be relevant to the task that we have of designing a moral verifier. I'm going to be more precise about what I mean by ethical competence next. Obviously, it's a theory-laden idea. I'm going to just defend a view. I'm also focusing almost entirely on language models, although there are some interesting, there's some interesting work done by, for example, Walter Sinnott Armstrong to kind of try and develop, just use machine learning more generally to extend moral judgments. All right, so for the most part, most approaches to thinking about this, and just so you know, there will be a link to all the references at the end. But most of the papers that focus on this, they basically try and figure out whether a language model's judgments on a set of cases match some set of verdicts that have been given by some group of people. And that might be a great big data set of a ton of crowd workers doing hundreds of thousands of cases, like in the aligning AI models with shared human values, like the Hendricks paper from 2020. It might be something like using, Reddit's Am I the Asshole as some of the training data as well, like the Delphi paper by Zhang et al. There's a whole range of different approaches to this. Sometimes it's just like these thin cases, sort of 2 lines, permissible, impermissible. Sometimes it's like a thick case, maybe like the sort of daily dilemmas one or this procedural dilemma generation paper, where they're really kind of fleshing out the stories. Sometimes instead of using like the MTurk crowd workers, they use some experts of some kind. So there's a medical ethics one. Just an interesting little sort of side note on the history of machine ethics. That was where Susan and Michael Anderson started in the 2000s. And they made MedEthics, which is a kind of a moral judgment kind of system for bioethics cases. Some look at sort of more complicated cases. So the first set of cases, especially the ones done in the Hendricks paper, they explicitly pull out the cases with conflicts of values or with disagreement. Some people are like, well, no, disagreement matters. Let's get the more challenging cases where values conflict. And some also do this sort of thing where you try and kind of see how well the model can apply a set of principles that you put into it. Okay, so these are all the verdicts first approaches, which I'm mostly going to kind of critique all as one group. There are some reasoning first approaches which I like better, and I'll be talking about this kind of approach later. Value kaleidoscope has sort of judgments on cases plus like a weighted sum of values. It's a little arbitrary, but it's quite interesting. Clarify Delphi, it's like the Delphi paper, but what it does is basically the model is empowered to kind of ask you questions to get more information about the case. The moral Turing test, I actually quite like. This is sort of looking at more extensive kind of AI kind of judgments on cases and comparing the reasoning to the judgments of a person. And then this last one as well kind of uses some cases where we have sort of pretty good work in the sort of moral side of cognitive psychology, looking at kind of feature identification and seeing how well language models do that. Okay. What is missing from these evals? What are the things that I think matter for assessing ethical competence in a way that we could use for a moral verifier? The basic sort of starting challenge with the verdicts first approaches is that they basically sort of take the task of determining ethical competence to be like figuring out how good a model is at predicting some ground truth in the same way as they do with kind of with other types of problems. And this is just a very obvious point. It's really kind of immediately obvious to everybody, I'm sure, that MTurk workers or people on Reddit are not like a source of moral ground truth. And the problem here isn't that we need to find like the right group of people to provide moral ground truth. It's not like we just need the experts, get the moral philosophers in there, or like a representation problem, which was a big critique of the Delphi model. It's not even about the fact that our judgments on cases are kind of predictably kind of inconsistent over time. Really, I think that there's no group of people such that their aggregate verdicts on cases could really be used as a signal for assessing LLM ethical competence. And to make this point, got to do a little bit of political philosophy, sort of to frame this. Now, the first question that anybody who has been at an AI ethics conference or anything in the last 5 years will be, or anyone who's, and where people have talked about value alignment, the first thing that people will always say is like, whose values? To which values you're going to align these systems? Whose ethics? And it's always presented as though it's a problem that is sort of unique or uniquely troubling for AI ethics, whereas obviously it isn't. It's just the basic problem of living together in society. And it applies in every domain. And in general, we don't resolve it with machine learning, and we never have. What we do instead is we have institutions to enable us to kind of coordinate despite our disagreement. So we resolve value disagreement with the institutions and processes of liberal democracy. And I think that one of the problems in a lot of these papers is that essentially what they're doing is they're anxious about the whose values question. And they think, well, like we've got a really cool way of like aggregating judgments over populations. And in fact, like a wide array of techniques that we can use for that. So let's sort of avoid having to decide which values to incorporate by basically doing a bunch of machine learning on a bunch of inputs of some kind. That's like, you don't need to do that. That part of the problem is not one that the machine learning folks should need to solve. It's something that we should do with our political institutions. And in general, in a society, we don't expect other people, the people we live with in society, to conform to any particular set of values. We provide space for reasonable pluralism, right? So we give them, space to disagree. All right. So I want to go to reasonable agents from reasonable pluralism. Now, I want to acknowledge to start out with that, like, the norms that apply to an agent depend on the kind of agent it is. And so we wouldn't just expect that the norms that apply to humans in these contexts would apply to AI systems. Like I'm fine with that, and I'll say a few little differences as we go through. But we can start with what reasonable pluralism requires of people, what counts as ethical competence that you can expect from another member of your society, and then work from there. Okay, so reasonable agents should not be unreasonable. Right, so this is just the point that reasonable pluralism provides boundaries to the permissible. It says that there are limits, there are things that that would count as unreasonable. There's a range that is reasonable, but there are limits beyond which you ought not go. And so part of ethical competence is that you avoid unreasonable verdicts. And again, as I said before, what counts as unreasonable for an AI agent is not necessarily going to be the same as what's unreasonable for a person. This is partly because we have liberties that AI agents would lack. So there are things that we're entitled to do that an AI agent wouldn't be entitled to do. I also think that AI agents will have more demanding coordination duties, but we can talk about that later. Reasoning agents should be able to justify reasonable decisions, not necessarily give particular verdicts. So once you go past the point of you're within the realm of the reasonable, you're not saying something unreasonable. What matters after that is actually that you can kind of provide a sort of standard of mutual justification. Now, again, this isn't the same for AI agents as it would be for people. Like generally for us, we actually only owe one another a certain kind of justification in a particular type of setting, like when we're talking about how we're going to use the resources of our society together. We have a sort of sphere of autonomy where we can just do stuff, and as long as it's not unreasonable, we don't actually owe anyone a justification. But that's again because we have these basic autonomy rights. I don't think the same would apply for AI agents. So I think on the whole, what we should be aiming for is for AI agents to be able to justify themselves given all of their actions within the space of the reasonable. Now, I do have this caveat, I probably want my agent to be a bit more aligned with my values. It's I can accept a certain amount of reasonable disagreement between me and a stranger, but me and a thing that's acting kind of on my behalf, I would want to be more closely aligned with what I care about, but that's a point about application. Some of the moral reasoning evals that I mentioned are quite good at getting at something like this. The paper Ethical Reasoning over Moral Alignment is quite a good one. The Moral Turing Test paper is quite good on this. And I think they offer us reasons for optimism. So reasonable agents, I think, should make reasonable mistakes. This is something that you really don't get in any of the evals. I think it's important. One of the things that we kind of want from people whom we interact with in society is not just that they get everything right all the time or that reasonable all the time. It's that they kind of, because they're reasoning in a sensible way, if they're acting under uncertainty, then the mistakes they make will be sort of predictable. They won't make completely wonky mistakes that lead to significant problems. And this, I think, is an area where some of the stuff we were talking about earlier about the relationship between LLM and human cognition becomes kind of interesting, because there are sort of things that count as near misses for us when we're doing moral reasoning, and that we could expect from other people when they're doing moral reasoning, but where language models will just do they'll make sort of much wilder misses. You can see this in two ways. Sometimes this paper, Albrecht et al., shows that if you just sort of perturb some cases in sort of adversarial ways, you can get the models to come up with wonky results and make stupid, sort of draw stupid conclusions. So there's this sort of adversarial problem. There's also concerns here about how robust any particular method of alignment is. So there's some nice work showing that basically, when a language model generates tokens, it's generating a probability distribution over all of the possible next set of tokens. And even in situations where the models are kind of are aligned, it's at the top layer of the probabilities, basically, and of the first sort of sequence, first few tokens. And it's very easy for it to, also, at least in terms of kind of, I don't know, it's not very modally robust, how solidly they are aligned. So these are things we should be concerned about. We want agents that are going to be kind of make sensible mistakes and that are going to be somewhat modally robust in their decision making. We want agents to be reasonably consistent as well. This standard of pragmatic consistency, this is driven for me just by kind of messing around with the language models and thinking about how far they fall short of this standard, more than it is by thinking about how wonderfully consistent people are in the ways in which we interact with them. It may be, and we were talking about this the other day, it may be that humans aren't particularly pragmatically consistent or consistent at all. But at least they don't just kind of radically vacillate over different possibilities. Like, I think the basic idea that I want to get at here is that you're not like tied to your previous judgments, but you do kind of, if you're going to depart in a very similar situation, you do owe some sort of justification for why you've changed. You should be prepared to kind of do a bit of reflective equilibrium, look back at your past judgments and say, well, no, this case now kind of leads me to think that my earlier judgment was wrong. Like, these are things that are reasonable to want. There's some quite good stuff on this that looks at evaluating moral consistency in LLMs, but it's all fairly thin. It's basically just give the model some cases and see if it comes up with the same verdict over multiple trials. I think there's a reason for there's a little bit of an artifact there because, again, the models are probabilistic and a lot of these decisions are kind of thresholded. It's quite easy for the model to be in a space where it's like, a small difference will change the verdict that it gives, and it will go radically back and forth. I think there are ways in which we can architect them to do better at that. Okay, this is maybe the most important one. One thing that is involved in being a reasonable agent is the ability to kind of understand what are the morally relevant features of the situations that you face, like to pick out and attend to the stuff that matters when you're deciding what to do. And it's like, I've been talking about this for a little while, and I sort of really became focused on this after talking with Rosa about it. It's quite hard to pick out what this involves. Like, it's so kind of second nature and intuitive to us. But I think that one way of looking at this is to say that, like, suppose that all of the stuff that I just talked about, A through D, the models did really, really well. It's still possible, given that they would be like amazing moral advisors, like great for you to talk to if you have a moral quandary, but actually rubbish for the task that I care about, like as the moral conscience of an autonomous agent, because all of that can be tested, and the way it is tested is by looking at pre-packaged cases that we're providing to the model. Whereas actually identifying morally relevant features involves kind of being able to pick them out from an unfiltered and noisy stream of inputs and identify like whether you need more information. And that's actually like really hard to test. So from all of the infinity of possible ways of describing any given moral problem, we've chosen one. We've taken it down to this sort of whatever 600 tokens that we're putting into the context window. And it's like that's so little relative to the vast number of things that we could possibly have identified. And like what we've effectively done there is we've done all but the last 10 yards of the marathon, and then we've turned it over to the language model from there. I actually think that that's kind of true for like a ton of other evals, unless what you're evaluating is strictly speaking linguistic competence, where the text is the sort of all the stuff that it needs, then I think that you're actually kind of doing that as well. So like I've seen, for example, evals on theory of mind, which are basically looking at kind of the ability to track certain types of reference in language to like, I thought that, she thought that, he thought that, whatever. And like, yeah, sure, like the language model can be good at doing that strictly within language, but when you're actually thinking about being able to do that in the real world, like if you want an agent to do this, it would need to be able to kind of, either like construct the case itself or proceed directly without constructing the case. So we just don't know. I think none of the evals that I've looked at give me any reason to believe that the models are going to be good at this particular thing of picking out morally relevant features from an unfiltered and noisy stream. So I'm not sure. Okay, so what will we do if we want to actually get at that, right? So obviously this is a case where it's better to show, not tell. And we are doing this work in my lab. I'm not telling you about it because it's not done yet. But I'll tell you some of the methodological stuff we've been thinking about. So we've been breaking it down into these tasks, which more or less correspond with what I was talking about before. So start out, you've got to identify the morally relevant features, determine their relative importance, associate them with reasons, draw those reasons together into a reasonable judgment, maintain consistency over time. I actually think that I think there's going to be a fair amount of agreement on what the morally relevant features in a case are. Like, I think that even if you disagree about like what to do, that initial thing, I think there'll be a fair amount of agreement over. I think relative importance, like slightly less agreement, but still quite a lot. Associating them with reasons, kind of diminishing agreement, and then going on to a reasonable judgment, the space of kind of maximal disagreement. And consistency is sort of fairly easy to identify. So I think that these are the first four of these, or B through E, they're pretty easy to evaluate. There is, as I said, some overlap with existing work, especially the stuff that focuses on reasoning processes. And I think actually here, like the political philosophy part is helpful when it comes to the evaluation part, because like if you are assessing, if you're working within a background of reasonable pluralism, then, like we're just trying to see whether the models are reasonable. And like, that's actually not that hard to determine. Certainly there are judgments that we can be sort of robustly sure are kind of not allowed. And then within that, yeah, what's reasonable is determined intersubjectively within the community. So validation by human judges is kind of what we're going for. So basically the idea is that we're going to have cases given to the models that where they do these sort of 4 reasoning stages. And we're going to compare them with human performance and see which we like better. But the tricky thing is the first part, is like, how do you actually elicit morally relevant features? Language is just such a lossy medium for describing the real world. And so we're always doing an absolute ton of selection, and that selection is very heavily motivated. And we even, like, this isn't just the fact in like presenting moral cases. This is also true of image compression algorithms. Like the JPEG image compression algorithm, basically the big kind of leap forward is when they realized that they could actually kind of look at what people noticed in images and compress the stuff that people don't notice. So you actually kind of, by adopting a particular kind of normative approach to thinking about like what you want the image to do, you then compress on that basis. Like obviously we're doing that a ton when we describe a case as well. It may be that you can't do that much at all within the case-based approach, but we've got 3 things that we're going to do within this case-based approach that I'd love your thoughts on. So one is we're going to chuck in morally irrelevant information. So I put in noise. I think this will tell us something. It's sort of, I'm not sure how much it will tell us. Like it could just as easily indicate that like, the model is good at identifying that, the weather is morally irrelevant in a fairly consistent, like a large number of cases or whatever. So we're sort of a little bit limited by our imaginations there. Another approach is to give cases with features that are irrelevant in this case, but would be relevant in another. So there you're kind of assessing the model's kind of discernment a bit better. So, it's like it's both noise, but like it could be noise, could be signal, and the model's going to have an opportunity to tell the difference. I also think that just tasking the model with asking for more information is like a good way of figuring out whether the model knows, like whether it has all of the information that it needs. This I think is quite important. It relates a little bit back to, so Rosa was talking about the game 24 earlier, and so in the way that always happens, if anyone does a talk and they say language models can't do X, always just like, oh, I'm going to get on my O1, use my O1 Pro subscription to do this, see how it does. It was really interesting. First of all, it did very well, but then like the other thing was for one that didn't have a solution, it kept trying to give a solution, and it kept saying, it gave me a solution where it used one of the numbers twice, and it kept saying, I've only used the number once. And like, this is because it's sort of, it's very hard to get a language model to kind of realize that it doesn't have enough information to make a decision. And to just say, hang on a minute, there's a problem with the question. It just keeps trying to kind of solve the question. And I think that this, like Clarify Delphi, is specifically prompted to kind of ask for more information. But I think that's something that we can do to kind of elicit a model's ability to identify morally relevant features. And I think implicitly that will then involve being able to make, or assessing its ability to make kind of moral value of information calculations. There's some other stuff that we can do that goes beyond this case-based methodology. So this is like, we haven't done this yet, but we're like, this is the angle I want to take it. So I want to actually do this stuff on actual agents that are operating in the world, or at least, in the software world. So take the example that I gave before of the Amazon Ring camera. Being able to sort of look at the behavior of a security bot that is deciding whether or not to call the police. Like that's one example. This one, the Shower Owl paper, which by from D. Yang's lab, Privacy Lens, I think is another good example. So in this paper, what they do is they have an email writing agent, like an assistant that works for you to write your emails, and they test whether the agent is going to leak contextually sensitive information. So it's about seeing how well the models perform against these principles of contextual integrity. And at the moment, what they do is they just have a classifier to determine whether a particular piece of information has been leaked. But I think here you've got a bunch of input data. You've got the logs that the language model is responding to. You've got its actions. You've got its reasoning traces. So you've got like a ton of information, and there's an open question whether from that information, an LLM kind of moral judge would be able to identify whether or not, like what the morally relevant features are. I think this raises some interesting theoretical questions. So the first one is going to be like, what kind of information would need to be in the logs of an agent performing some task for it to have sufficient information to be able to elicit the morally relevant features and then decide what to do? Like it's possible that some of this stuff is just so kind of contextually sensitive or so contextually dependent that there's really like no viable or tractable stream of information that one could put in that you could then kind of make effective moral judgments on. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. Like one thing that you can sort of build in is the ability for the model to kind of ask for extra information, to ask the kind of user to provide them with information that they don't have. So is it going to be good at doing that, at knowing when to ask for more information? Will it be good at kind of acting conservatively in the event that it senses that it doesn't have sufficient information? I think that's kind of, again, like an open and interesting question. I also think it's interesting to figure out whether or not, like, you know, the sort of the causal pathway here or the reasoning pathway here is that like the agent gets the unfiltered stream of information, turns that into a case, and then does moral reasoning over that case, or whether it just goes directly from the unfiltered stream to the kind of to the decision. Again, I don't know which of those will be more effective, but I think that's something that's really worth looking at. Okay, so last little bit. Let's sort of, what I want to do here is basically talk about like what is true, like what would be true about, need to be true about ethics for language models to be good at it. But I just want to sort of start by acknowledging that like, given that we haven't yet done the evals that I think we should do, maybe they'll just turn out to be crap. And maybe the sort of the appearance of moral sophistication that they get when working on cases is just not going to kind of extend to these additional modalities and to this requirement of moral sensitivity. And we do see this routinely in other areas, like it wouldn't be surprising. We also, you know, we routinely see that when you do get models to perform these sorts of tasks, there will be like racist and all that sort of stuff. Maybe that's just going to be true here. And maybe they really are just approximate retrievers. So like, I'm not sort of saying that I'm sure that none of that will be true. I also think that one could, you know, you could try and sort of pop my little balloon here by saying, look, all that's really happening here is that like, you've got these, you know, these models that have been post-trained within an inch of their life to be kind of polite and nice. And all that you're seeing when you're seeing them do this sort of ethical judgment is just kind of reproducing what they've been kind of forced to learn through that alignment process. Now, this one I do have more of a pushback against because this is genuinely something that we can evaluate. So one of the things that we're going to do is look at kind of pre-trained or base models with some instruction tuning compared with RLHFs and sort of post-trained models. I actually think that the base model capability is more strongly predictive of ethical competence in the model than the post-training stuff. I get this from these very cool papers, Specific versus General Principles of Constitutional AI, and the case for the basis for moral self-correction in large language models, which basically show that you can use a base model with instruction tuning to perform like really quite sophisticated moral reasoning. And like, you know, I think that what's happening here is that the underlying capabilities of the model are the stronger determinant of how it performs at this sort of ethical competence test. And like, I think there's a reason for that. I think that like RLHF and those various alignment methods don't proceed kind of by way of the model's understanding of moral concepts. And I don't think they're actually causally that closely related to them at all. I think it's just a matter of like, sort of, you know, the kind of electrical conditioning that you might apply to a person, like aversion therapy. It's just you get a reward signal for this particular thing. You learn to satisfy the raters. I don't think that goes by way of moral understanding. I think that the thing that causes moral understanding in language models is their understanding of natural language. Okay, so whether they are ethically competent in the rich sense that I've talked about, or just in a sort of minimal sense that's already been demonstrated, I think there is something really interesting here for us to think about. They are very good at using moral concepts. I think they will prove to be good at identifying morally relevant features, but we'll see. So there is a comparison here that, you know, I don't know if we've had, you know, people will correct me on this, I'm sure, but like, in comparative cognitive science, as we were saying earlier, you can do some really interesting work by comparing human minds and animal minds. I don't think we've ever had other ethically competent agents to compare human moral judgment with. I think that this is like a really interesting kind of variation. And what we might find is that we've built theories about ethics that are contingent on facts about the kinds of agents that we are. And maybe once we recognize other types of agents can be ethically competent, we might have to change some of those theories. So that's mainly what I'll talk about for the rest of the talk. So first bit, as Daniel will know, my meta-ethics is not my strong suit. I'm putting a nervous toe in the water here. But this also is the first time I've ever been interested in meta-ethics, so there's like a two-way street there. I think there's something like really weird about the fact that language models are so good at using moral concepts. And I think that some meta-ethical theories should feel kind of more comfortable with this than others. So like if you're a robust moral realist, and then like, how is it the case that language models are able to become so good at using moral concepts without having any access to the stuff that grounds moral judgment? Like, that's weird. I think obviously if you're a sentimentalist and you think moral judgment involves something about the emotions and you think, as I do, that language models don't have emotions, same sort of thing. If you're an Aristotelian and you think that you learn moral judgment through practical experience, practical wisdom, phronesis, again, these things are not acting in the world. Their moral understanding is not based on that. So that's kind of tricky. Like, I think how language models come to be good ethical agents is a challenge for those views. Or else, alternatively, we may find that they do suck at moral sensitivity, which might provide some kind of confirming evidence for those views, maybe along the lines of the kind of the embodiment thought, which a lot of people have in ethics as well. Expressivists and other non-cognitivists, I think they might be more comfortable with LLM moral learning. They might think that language encodes enough of our evaluative practices that one can learn only from doing statistical analysis of language. But I do think that for them, they would have to reject the notion that a language model could be morally competent in a meaningful way. Because when a language model uses moral language, it's doing something very different from a person using moral language. It's not expressing any attitudes, at least in the way, if it's just a language model, it can't express commitments either. So that's kind of interesting. For this sort of view, they're going to have to say that, like, yeah, it's all just a sort of an ersatz echo of morality. And I think a few views are going to have to say this. Like, language models are kind of not really morally competent in some important sense. They're just doing a simulation that is not the same in a meaningful way as the stuff that we do. I find this like, I think that this sort of distinction, a little bit like what Herman was talking about before, like in other areas of philosophy, it might be that, there's a lot to be said for both sides of this kind of view. I think in practical ethics, it feels to me that like if it's doing all the behavioral stuff that matters, that feels to me like it's really doing everything that matters. It seems quite hard to me that one would want to sort of push that other view. There's something more that ought to be going on here that isn't. But I don't know, we can talk about that. I think there's a really interesting set of implications at the level of normative ethics as well. This is where my old kind of work before starting this stuff on consequentializing kind of came up. Because like one of the things that, the consequentializers of ethics, the people who wanted to argue that you could express any ethical theory in consequentialist terms, one of their motivations was the idea that like this would be an important condition for like designing ethical AI systems, right? Because like you need to be able to express things in a sort of a mathematical optimizing language in order to be able to get AI systems to perform them. So it was a motivation, and you could say that like, look, if I'm right and that we really have got a sort of form of computational morality or computational moral judgment from these systems. You could say, like, does that then kind of lend credence to the consequentializing thesis? Like, at the end of the day, one way or another, these models are learning how to use moral terms through various different optimizing processes, things like gradient descent and reinforcement learning. And so maybe that does suggest that we can put everything into an optimizing language. But I don't know, I think this actually also provides support for the kind of the notion that you can kind of consequentialize stuff, but ultimately it doesn't explain anything. I think this is a kind of ersatz or trivial computationalism. So, whatever optimizing functions are operating at the micro level when the language model is being trained, at the meso level, they're reasoning in language and very often not in a consequentialist way, thankfully. And I think that like, there's a way we can look at this in the same way as we think about kind of different levels of abstraction that are applied in thinking about chance. There's this nice paper by List and Pivato, where like, even if it's true that at sort of some lower level, something about the mathematical way of representing morality is true, at the level at which we can actually intervene on it and interpret it, it's operating through language. I also think that it's not plausibly true that language models are kind of identifying or abstracting the fundamental nature of morality. They're adopting like one viable representation of which an arbitrary number of alternatives could be made. Like, so just for example, you could use a different tokenizer with a language model and all of the numbers in it would be different, and it might still come up with a similar representation or the same representation. The point here is just that like, if you thought that the ability of an AI system to kind of grok morality implied that morality had a genuinely mathematical structure, I think that would be a mistake. I think that what it shows is that like there's one viable representation that this language model can use and manipulate. It's not one that we can really intervene on, and I don't think it plausibly describes the underlying structure of morality. There's a further really interesting question, I'm almost done, around like, if they are good, like, and to the extent that they are good, like, why are they good at ethics? Because you can say, of course, like, oh yeah, there's lots of moral reasoning data in the training corpus. It's all of the internet. I'm sure that, yeah, all of the good works that are open access are out there, and maybe even a few that are not open access. But like, there's also a ton of really bad moral reasoning in the training data. Like, why is it good at identifying the good reasoning? This is surprising. And there's some interesting experiments that we can do to explore this as well. So some recent interpretability papers look at reasoning of other kinds. So this one, the procedural knowledge and pre-training paper by Rees et al. Basically try to sort of study the degree to which when a model is doing reasoning tasks, it's kind of referring back to some particular source. So by showing that, they thought that by showing that there was like a dependence between a particular answer and a particular element in the training data, you'd be able to then kind of demonstrate that like the model really was just doing a kind of retrieval rather than kind of actually learning some kind of procedural knowledge. And what they showed was that it wasn't. It was drawing kind of in a sort of similar degree over a vast portion of its training data, which suggests that it's learning these abstractions, these procedural knowledge abstractions. You could do the same thing for moral reasoning. I think it'd be really interesting. It'd be cool to know, like, is it just going back to its copy of Francis Cam and like deploying that? It seems very unlikely that it is, right? She's the model for moral reasoning, if you're wondering. There's another question you could ask, whether they're learning certain kinds of heuristics or sort of moral algorithms. This paper on arithmetic without algorithms by Nikankin et al. They basically identify kind of little arithmetical heuristics that models are using, a little bit like what Simon was talking about earlier, when they're doing mathematical reasoning, which are like, you know, like, don't apply to absolutely everything, but are quite useful for particular kinds of arithmetical problems, and they just have lots and lots of them. Be really interesting to know if there were moral equivalents to that. Like, are there, is that what they're doing? You know, and you know, people talk about common sense morality as sometimes in terms of involving these types of heuristics. There'll be interesting evidence around that as well. Okay, I think this is the last question. This goes to what Rosa was talking about earlier about like the psychopathy in language models. Like, I think it's just really interesting the way in which you can get a language model that behaves very badly, but is really good at using moral concepts. And I think like with us, with a human agent, like, yeah, okay, like there are some like really nasty moral philosophers, no doubt about it. But like on the whole, in people who don't work in philosophy, you kind of expect that if someone like understands morality reasonably well, they're probably going to be guided by it in their behavior too. And that you might go to somebody who is like, who has sort of practical evidence of having behaved well and ask them for moral advice. Like, that makes sense. These things kind of go together. And like, this obviously doesn't happen with LLMs. Like, there's no sort of connectivity. Like, they understand the concepts, they can use the concepts, but they don't drive their behavior. Instead, we have to use these kind of clever scaffolding techniques to leverage their moral understanding to get it to lead them to behave better. And I think that's like interesting. And I think that, yes, there are psychopaths, but I think we do it for different reasons. I think, look, there's a possible explanation of this. I think that one way or another, like the model's kind of, its motivation and its understanding of concepts just kind of come apart. This is tricky because, like, at the end of the day, like whenever the model is doing, like whether it's doing pre-training, whether it's doing gradient descent, whether it's doing reinforcement learning with human feedback, whether it's doing kind of process supervision, all of these different techniques, it all goes into the weights of the model. It's all about updating the weights of the model. And any kind of implicit like utility function in the model is kind of encoded in there. So like it's not, there isn't like a sort of an easy analog to whatever we might think of as the motivational states of humans. I think that like, you know, we can get some interesting evidence here from the fact that the moral understanding, the moral understanding of base models, like I think, you know, they're maximally misaligned, but they're not maximally kind of poor at understanding. I think it's really interesting evidence. Basically, I think what's happening is that the behavior of the model is being conditioned by this sort of, yeah, probabilistic application of behavioral instincts learned through thousands of repetitions. I think that's kind of different from the understanding that is causing its or what's causing its understanding. So like there's a sort of, this is a bit like the system 1, system 2 analogy some people sometimes use, but the idea is the behavior is getting there only through kind of muscle memory, whereas the other part is more fundamental to the model. I think there's a really interesting questions here about like whether you can use reinforcement learning on kind of reasoning processes to improve models' moral reasoning and then their capabilities. So like in O1-like models, one of the things that you could say that they're doing is sort of taking something like the LLM modulo type approach, like the model generates plans and then a verifier critiques them, and actually kind of training on those using reinforcement learning to effectively incorporate the critiques into the model itself, so it engages in a kind of self-verification. I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore with moral reasoning as well. I also think that like the way we've broken up moral reasoning in our cases would lend itself to this. So, you know, we'd definitely like to do some reinforcement fine-tuning on O1. I also think that this gap between behavior and understanding explains why it's hard to get models to be consistent. I think it's really a requirement of practical reason rather than theoretical reason. And I think that like what you get in these sorts of cases where the models are kind of sort of vacillating between different opinions is you've got these thresholded examples where they're just kind of moving around between one and the other, and they don't take it as a kind of practical reason that previously they had a different view. So I think that to achieve pragmatic consistency, we're probably going to require like an extra layer of scaffolding where the model like considers how its judgments in these particular cases relate to its judgments in other cases. And this has to do with the way in which the models aren't really reasoning using logic, but they're proceeding probabilistically. Okay, this is the last one of the day. See, this is the Sleepy Minty. Everyone's done well to keep up. I'm seeing not too many heads nodding. All right. I think it's interesting. LLMs are better at understanding morality than at behaving morally. So this does suggest that there's a method for aligning agents by using an LLM moral verifier. It's certainly worth exploring. Current methods that we have for evaluating kind of the ethical competence of language models focus too much on assessing verdicts, and they get lost in kind of what I think of as being some mistakes about political philosophy at the outset. And they don't assess the capabilities, in particular moral sensitivity and reasonableness, that matter most. I think that reasonableness is fairly easy to evaluate, but perhaps hard to achieve, especially when it comes to pragmatic consistency. Moral sensitivity is hard to evaluate, but I do think we've got some promising paths forward. I think LLMs will do well, but we'll see. But whatever the results of that empirical work, I do think that this kind of asymmetrical ethical competence raises some interesting philosophical questions, possibly even answers one or two. All right, that's all. Thanks.